And we've been studying leadership for quite a few years, over 10 years now. And we were approached by the McCormick Foundation in 2008, and they were really concerned about the misalignment between the early childhood systems and the K-12 world. So that's when we started taking a look at this P3 system and how do we, particularly, how do we get leaders, both the school principals, district superintendents, and early childhood leaders to start creating that alignment between the systems. And that's where this study comes into. It's just one spin-off of some of that work. So just to take you through the agenda for the day, or for this time, first of all, I'll just kind of set the context for the work, why we decided to pursue this study. Connect to the pre-K-3 Danielson project, so I'll give you an update of where we are, what this research looks like, and where we are at in terms of conducting that research right now. Then I'll take you through the Danielson framework. It'll be kind of a quick Danielson 101. And that then will help set the stage for us having a discussion about what the implications are for early childhood teacher education. Okay, so in 2010, our state passed the Performance Evaluation Reform Act that all teachers and principals will have to be evaluated. And so within those legislative requirements, typically our early childhood teachers, particularly at that pre-K level, have never been part of that evaluation process. So with this new legislation, preschool teachers who are in our state preschool programs have to be evaluated as well. So that begged the question of and we heard from many people who started studying the teacher evaluation in Illinois, that most of the districts, or quite a few of the districts, were going to be using the Danielson framework. So then that begged the question, well, is the Danielson framework valid for those teachers at that early childhood level, pre-K through 3? It's been validated 4th grade and up, but it's never been validated or studied at that pre-K through 3rd grade level. And so again, talking about that misalignment between early childhood programs and K-12, when we talked about leadership, and one of the things that we found out is that oftentimes the people who are leading our early childhood programs, particularly if the pre-K program is in a K-12 school district and in a K-12 building, oftentimes that leadership doesn't have that early childhood background experience. A lot of our principals are former middle school teachers, former high school teachers, and so there was a big fear out there that we were going to have these people come in and observe pre-K teachers or those K through 3 teachers and start pushing down the what we think is good practice in middle school and high school, and start pushing that down and giving unfair evaluations and not feedback that's not helpful for those early childhood teachers in growing their practice. So that's what spawned this research study. So basically then what we're trying to do with this study, just in a nutshell, is just, is the Danielson framework tool a good common framework, for creating that alignment? If we have principals using the Danielson framework for those 4th through 12th grade teachers, can we use this tool as a way of creating that alignment between the pre-K and 3rd grade teaching, those teaching grades, rather than having principals do 3 different types of frameworks, but hopefully using the Danielson tool as a kind of a policy lever for bringing those 2 fields together, but making sure then that we're using it in a developmentally appropriate way. So the project work today, in September 2012, we started bringing early childhood practitioners together, administrators and teachers and policy advocates, and start taking a look at the Danielson framework and looking at it from that early child perspective. When we first started, we really start doing kind of an in-depth analysis, and I know there's a couple people who are involved in that, and it's pretty intense. We were going through almost line by line, trying to see, well, what does this mean for early childhood? At that time, the Danielson started being studied, and these teacher evaluation models started getting a lot of attention in the research field, and so people were coming up to Charlotte at conferences. Well, can we adapt it for special education teachers? Can we adapt it for this? Can we adapt it for this? And so finally, she gave our Danielson consultant a call and said, I'm really concerned about people taking this framework and just adapting it without really much thought or depth. So she asked us to stay at that early learning, at those early learning example levels, study the Danielson through our research study, then come back with those research results, and then talk about making adaptations to the language within the domains and the components and critical attributes. So that's basically where we're at right now in terms of we aren't modifying the big language in the Danielson framework. Right now we're just trying to develop examples and then study that framework to see if adaptations need to be made. So then, so as we can see, we've been working on those early learning frameworks with local practitioners, with the National Board Center teachers. We now are working with a cadre of Preschool for All coaches to take a look at the early learning examples that were developed and going back and revising those. And we've met a couple times, and we're continuing that work as well. And we're also in discussions about we're working actually with what was the Illinois Resource Center to start thinking about, well, what kinds of professional development do we need to provide to the early childhood field around the Danielson framework. So we're starting to engage in those conversations as well. So the study really essentially has three purposes. One is to study the validity of the Danielson framework for evaluating teachers in early childhood classrooms, to study whether the framework provides accurate feedback, accurate and reliable data so that pre-K third teachers and their supervisors can identify strengths and areas for growth and then use that data to engage in that coaching conversation. And then the third one is to develop training and resources that support early childhood teachers and their supervisors. So one of the things that we're hoping, as you can see, we really have had a focus on thinking about, well, what resources and training do we need to provide those early childhood teachers and their leaders? So this is kind of a new discussion about, well, what are the implications then for the teacher education field? The study participants, we have 7 districts. 4 of them are early learning centers within the district. We have 7 schools. 1 community-based center. This is actually a private community-based center, so that's why I didn't include it as part of that district. But if you included it as a district, then there essentially would be 8 districts. 3 of them are in the northern section of Illinois, 2 are central, 3 southern. 1 would be classified as being urban, 2 would be classified as rural, and then the others would be kind of considered like the Bloomington Normals, small, big town, small urban type centers. We have 26 teachers, 14 of whom are in our pre-K programs, and 12 that are in the K-3 elementary classrooms. We have 3 internal observers. So we have 12 internal observers. So these are, one's a teacher leader, 2 are the pre-K coordinators, and 9 of them are classified as principals. And then we have 3 external observers who came in to do paired observations, so they are external to the schools and the programs. All 3 of them have pre-K-3 administrative and teaching experience, and they've all used the Danielson framework in their leadership to evaluate their pre-K-3 teachers. The students, we've been collecting demographic data on the students that are in the teachers' classrooms. So here you can see, and I'm not sure, the legend's not coming up, but you'll see then that we have in the pre-K, 57% of our students are in the pre-K classrooms. 17% are in our kindergarten classrooms. Another big chunk are in our 3rd grade classrooms. And then the last ones are in our 2nd grade. We ideally in our model, we wanted the pre-K classrooms, kindergarten, and 3rd. But there were a couple principals who really wanted to bring in like their 2nd grade teacher because they really felt like this was a professional development opportunity. So we allowed them to bring those other additional teachers in. And then we have 1 teacher who's a bilingual teacher. So student ethnicity, we have a really good diverse student population. So as you'll see, we have about 1/3 that would be Black or African American. We have another 1/3 that would be the Hispanic or Latino, and then the other 1/3 that are white. Lunch status, we have quite a few, and the reason why these numbers are different is that not all of our student in the databases, not all of the schools or the programs collect all this data evenly, so we're trying to clean this up. So you'll see there's we had about 620 total students, and now we've only got this data for 268 of the students. So of those, the majority are in the get free lunches, and then you'll see then the majority of them do not receive, would not be considered special education students. So first, in validating the framework, we have both a quantitative and qualitative methodology. First, we're collecting student assessment scores. So we collected that at the beginning of the year in the fall for our baseline data, and we'll collect that data, that student assessment data, at the end of the year, which we've asked them to wait as long as possible to the end of the year. Using the assessments that they currently use, we had hoped that there would be a common assessment, but you'll see in a further slide that there's not many common assessments. So Then what we'll do then is correlate that with the ratings that the teachers received. What you hope to see if it's a valid instrument is that if the teachers receive proficient and excellent ratings, that there would be a corresponding upward trajectory of student learning. If you see basic and unsatisfactory scores, then you would hope to see then, if it's a valid framework, that the student learning would have a downward trajectory. So we have also, in the quantitative, we have the evaluator, the internal and external observer evidence. So as I said, in the fall, we did paired observations so that the external went in with the internal observer. They looked at they watched the same teacher practice, and then they went back to their respective corners and coded that data based on what they felt were where they felt like what they saw. And then now we're taking that data and we're coming back and collecting those inter-rater or calculating those inter-rater reliabilities. So, and one thing, in our study, a lot of times in the studies of the Danielson framework and other teacher evaluation models, they've always done it at the rating level. So what they would do is, if they got proficiency, they would just take that proficient rating and then calculate that or correlate that with the student assessment data. We wanted to go a little bit deeper. So what we had our raters do was they observed, and then they came and they highlighted which of the critical attributes. So as part of that inter-rater reliability, then what we did is we did a match. How many of those critical attributes match? Rather than doing, because a lot of times when you just do it at that rating level, proficient, excellent, you don't get that in-depth. They may have rated. There's so many critical attributes within the Danielson. They may have gave them a proficient rating, but they may have done it for different reasons. And we were wanting to see, do they feel like they're seeing the same things when they walked in and observed that same classroom? So as you can see, that's just kind of an example of what we had them do. That's the data that we got back from them. In terms of the qualitative study, one of the things that we're doing too with that observation data, when we pull it down, we're able to go in and look at that observation data and then code it for accuracy and reliability. So we are looking at, did they sort the observation data into the correct domain? Did they use low bias evidence? So is the data, specific enough that we're able to tell what it is? Can we see the story of the classroom? Student engagement, did they talk about what the students are doing in the classroom and it's not just what the teacher's doing? We're also looking at, based on that evidence that was provided, do we feel like they identified the correct critical attribute and at the correct performance level rating? We're also, here in the next few weeks, we'll start going out to the sites and talking with the teachers and leaders and just start getting their observations about how they felt about using the Danielson framework. Did they see any challenges? Did they like the framework? What did they feel was most useful? And then where they feel like there might be some misinterpretations, where they feel like the Danielson needs to be modified, and then what training and resources are needed to support our early childhood teachers and leaders. So this here, and if you take a look at this, you'll be able to see it much better if you look at the actual handout. This is the process that our leaders, our teachers and our leaders, or observers in the research are going through. So if you'll see stage 1, they started out with planning the conference, participating in a planning conversation using the planning protocol. So the teacher and I'll just use principal as the generic term, but the teacher and the principal go into the room. The external observer came in so that they would hear the same conversation and have the same data as that internal observer. But the external observer did not participate in their conversation. So they couldn't kind of influence what that conversation, they could only ask clarifying questions. Then they went into the observation, whenever the observation was scheduled. So the internal and external observer went in, based on that planning on conversation, observed the lesson or the classroom time that they had agreed upon. And then both the internal and external observer went back and coded and sorted the data accordingly. So then after the observation was conducted, then the internal and external observer both went in with the teacher again and engaged in that reflection conference. And again, the external observer was not allowed to ask any questions or participate in that discussion except to ask clarifying questions. In the spring, what will be different, or what they're doing now, they're doing the formal observation that they did in the fall was a full classroom. Take a look comprehensively at the Danielson, collect data on the whole, domains 1, 2, 3, and 4. In the spring, it'll be a much more targeted informal observation process. So it'll be 15 or 20 minutes. They'll take a look. We ask them, and you'll find out sooner, but we ask them to focus on a specific cluster. And so they do not have to do the planning conference. State law says you do not have to engage in a planning conference, so we had them stay with what the state policy is. And so they will go in, and the external observer is not involved at this time. It's just the internal. They'll go in, do the observation, and they'll just code and sort data on that one cluster that we asked them to. So that's a little bit different. But again, I think that gives us also some data on that state policy and whether they feel like that's a good way of collecting data. So I think I've alluded to this a little bit, where right now we finished up with the fall observation data. They finished up with those observations in December. We've been taking that data, cleaning it, organizing it so that we could start the analysis. And then now we're in the spring data collection where they're doing the informal observations. They started those April 1st, and we gave them until May 15th. Student assessment data, our partners at the University of Illinois in Champaign will start collecting that data in late May. And then we'll do the qualitative interviews starting here in a couple weeks. So this summer then will be a lot of data analysis, compile the report, and then we'll bring back our research participants and present the findings to them first and allow them to give us some feedback on how they feel we've interpreted the findings and if they have any further feedback for us. So I've talked about the student assessments. And so at the beginning of the year, when we started reaching out, when we start working with the research participants, we start working with the principals and asking them, well, what assessments do you use? Hoping that we'd find a couple that was being used across the state. This is what we got. So, as you'll see, the first, I think, 5 are bolded. Those are the only ones that are used in more than one classroom. And all the rest are in different classrooms. Some classrooms are using 2, some are using 5. So did you have a question?
I'm sorry, Lisa, this is across pre-K through 3rd.
Pre-K through 3rd. Yep. So what this essentially does for us, then our University of Illinois partners basically have to come in and standardize the test scores, and for every child, they'll have to measure whether there was learning that took place from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and then kind of count up how many students had learning. So that's going to be one of the challenges of how we use the student assessment data.
Are you going to correlate it all with the part which was given this year for the first time?
Yeah, no, we won't. We won't be able to do that because we wouldn't be able to. We don't have the resources to be able to collect that park data, and you know that might maybe in a future time, but
That's across the state.
right. Yeah, so this says a lot about our assessment process around the state. After I saw this, I thought, wow, and hearing about the discussions going around the park assessments, I thought, I think we just need to get a group of really smart people in the room, take a look at take an inventory of all the assessments we use, find out what purposes, which ones do the best at capturing our data, and then just, maybe coming up with a list of like 10 or 12 that we feel like do the best and offering that to the districts and our programs, and because this is just a little crazy.
Just out of curiosity, do you know if any of your K classrooms were using kids?
No, they were not. Because we were going to collect the kids' assessment data. We weren't going to use it, or we were going to use it if we could, just to see, maybe we wouldn't report out but nobody was using it.
Thanks.
Lisa, how many kindergarten classrooms there were?
Let's see, I'm trying to remember. There was probably about, of all of them, probably about 5 or 6. Yeah.
That helps, Joyce.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said it was only 5 or 6 kindergarten, so it
Yeah.
makes it much better.
Yeah. So it's not. Yeah. So before we continue on, is there any questions about the research? Go ahead.
I have a quick question. I see that this is a Performance Evaluation Reform Act of 2010, so it's legislative. Is that state or federal?
State.
Okay. And does this tool, implementing the Danielson framework, does this replace an existing tool, or is this one that is coming out of
No, basically in the law, and I took out the slides because I was afraid it would take up too much time, but as part of for this legislative, every district puts together a joint education committee, and then they, as a committee, and there's there's rules on who has to be involved in that committee, and then every district decides what instrument. The instrument does have to have some ramifications, or some parameters. It has to be research-based. It has to be aligned to the Illinois professional teaching standards, and it has to cover the domains of planning, instruction, and kind of that environment piece. So there are some parameters on what they can use, but if they want to use like the Marzano or some other, they can do that.
So you're testing to see if the Danielson is a good one that everyone should.
Yeah, because what we heard was that the Danielson was the most popular.
Okay,
Yeah.
and it's not replacing anything. There, previously it was catch as catch can, district
Right.
by district, school by school, but
Right.
how
Yeah.
they evaluate the
Right.
students. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem. Go ahead.
Is there any room for observational data in terms of assessment? Are they all formal assessments?
Yeah, and well, I mean, in terms of the state law, there is the student learning objective process for the non-tested grades, which the early childhood grade span would fit into. And so the ISB website just, I think within the last month or two, issued out guidance on or a template for what the early learning SLO process would look like. Basically it's just the teachers working with their leader in developing and working, teachers working with teachers, looking at their assessment data, which we just saw need some help, and using that to develop goals for the students in their classroom based on the individual, the students that they have in their classroom, choosing what assessment, if I have a goal, well, what assessment would best fit, would give me the best data that I need. So I think that student learning objective process does allow for that observational evidence, much more so than what we get with the big state. And actually at the non-tested grade, you don't have to use any state assessments. It can be district, whatever the district is using as a whole, and then what the individual teachers want to use. Yep. And I do have on the website that I gave you earlier, I do have the state a section where the state policy is included, so you can take a look at that if you want to get a little deeper into what that policy actually looks like. So I think then what we'll do is we'll dive into the Danielson framework, just in a 101 approach. So I'll probably do a lot of talking, and then after that, I want to open it up and then engage in the discussion and let you talk. I don't want to sit here and talk for an hour and a half. So first of all, the Danielson framework has gone through several iterations. Right now, the latest iteration, and that's the framework that you have, is the 2013 framework, and that's based on a study that was being conducted on the Common Core. So it just adds a lot of the Common Core language. It also, in the 2011 is when they added the critical attributes, which they felt was very helpful in pulling down the domains and making them kind of come alive. The assumptions, it has a constructivist philosophy, so teachers as facilitators of learning and working with students so that students engage in the learning and take ownership of their learning. Teaching is purposeful, so teachers make their choices based on their desired instructional outcomes. It's comprehensive and coherent, so it goes through the whole teaching process from planning to the environment to the instruction to the planning and reflection and growing their professionalism. It's generic, so it's intentionally written to go across the grade level, so it's not specific to high schools, it's not specific to middle schools, but it's tailored to go through the entire span. It's aligned with research and teaching standards, so those national board standards, the INTAS standards. It's public, so it's always been available to teachers, so it's not a big secret. You can get the rubric, and then teachers and leaders can engage in those discussions. It has a cycle of inquiry and professional growth, which is that plan, teach, reflect, apply cycle, and that it's independent of any teaching methodology. So just if you take a look at your page, your Danielson on a page, we have 4 domains, so that's these big chunks. The 22 components, which are kind of these, 1As, 1Bs, excuse me. That's your components. And then within, underneath each one of those are the elements, which again are more of kind of the indicators of what each one of those components and domains look like. So domain 1, what a teacher knows and does in preparation for teaching. So this goes to that comprehensiveness. Domain 2, the classroom environment. So that's creating that culture of learning in the classroom. Domain 3 is the instruction, what a teacher does to engage students in learning. And then 4, this is the professional responsibilities. This is, maintaining accurate records, reflecting on your teaching and trying to improve it, engaging in the community in terms of like professional organizations to continue growing your practice, working with families. And again, as you'll see, those kind of went into that clockwise pattern, and that's sort of that plan, teach, reply process that I talked about earlier. So those are the domains and components, and again, this is what's on your sheet. And then within the rubric, and you'll see the rubric on your kind of your big handout, it has levels of performance, and the critical attributes are kind of inherent in the levels of performance. So you have unsatisfactory, which is actually, the teacher's really kind of just doing harm. There is no learning going on. We should be putting a stop to this and pulling the teacher out and really giving them some intense professional development. Then we have the needs improvement. They're showing that they kind of know what they're doing, but it's really inconsistent. And again, they're not really doing harm, but they're really not advancing teaching or advancing learning either. Proficient, this is kind of where they hope everybody is kind of at. These are teachers that are effective. They're engaging their students in learning. It's consistent. And this is, where you would hope to see the majority of the teaching practice taking place. And then we have the excellent or distinguished level, and that's kind of at that proficient level, but just extended. Students are really taking ownership of their learning. They're engaged. So this is where, where you would really see classroom routines, functioning smoothly and doing so on a consistent basis. Whenever you go through kind of the Danielson training, you don't expect to see a teacher at a proficient or distinguished level consistently across. They always call it a dance, so they might be unsatisfactory in some things, they might be proficient in others, they might do a dance between proficient and excellent, and that's, I think that's because it is so comprehensive, because it is broken out in so many of those components and elements, that really gives that teacher some really detailed information on where they could really strengthen that practice. And so these are just kind of some of the words that they use whenever they talk about what these different performance levels. And there has been another study that the Chicago Consortium conducted on the Danielson up in the CPS schools, and this shows what they found a correlation between those teachers who got the poor ratings. You can see there was student learning that was at that downward trajectory. And then at the proficient level, which is interesting, it was effective. There was upward trajectory in the reading, but not so much in the math. But then at that distinguished level, you'll see there was an upward trajectory of student learning in both reading and math. So getting even further then into the Danielson framework, you'll see you have this handout, and you almost need to have these two side by side, because whenever you have the clusters, it kind of hides some of this language within the framework. But there's been recent research on the Danielson, and when they did the analysis of where ratings were coming out, they noticed that there was kind of correspondences between some of these components. So you'll see they put them into clusters, which I think is very helpful, because a lot of times I know when I first started going through this training, I thought, wow, 22 components, and each one of these components has 3 or 4 elements, and how do you put this together? Well, I think these clusters start helping people put this together. So we can see there's these 5 clusters. In the domain 1, which is your design, you have the design cluster, which encompasses 1C, 1F, and 1E. You'll notice that some of the elements are not, some of the components are not in that cluster, but essentially what that means is it is distinguishing between what the teacher knows versus what the teacher does. So you have to know, you have to have that knowledge of content and pedagogy, you have to have knowledge of students, you have to have knowledge of resources in order to be able to set appropriate instructional outcomes, in order to design your instructional, coherent instruction, and in order to design those student assessments. Then, so that's kind of off stage, and then we go into the classroom and we look at the classroom environment. And this one then has the management cluster. So this is what kind of environment is the teacher, based on their planning, what kind of a culture of learning have they created? 2A is not part of that management cluster, but that's because it informs that management cluster. So you have to the goal is to create that environment of respect and rapport. And you do that by managing classroom procedures, making sure you have smooth transitions, making sure that student behavior is monitored and you're able to effectively address inappropriate behavior and get the kids back on track, and then good organization of your physical space, making sure kids and teachers are able to move around the space safely and easily. Then we have that instructional piece, and that actually was broken up into two clusters, the engagement and assessment cluster. The engagement cluster does include one component from the classroom environment cluster, but this one really talks about, well, what are the students doing? How are they engaged in that learning? How are the teachers communicating with students, and what kinds of questions are they asking them to elicit that learning? And then we have that last cluster, which is the assessment cluster, which is using the assessment and the instruction. How is the teacher, formatively monitoring students' understanding, and then how are they using that then to, either on the spot, or both on the spot, make modifications to the instruction and the learning activities, and then when they go back and reflect, how do they make sure that whatever the outcomes or how that classroom, learning activity, going back to your planning and making sure that the next time you've learned from your mistakes and use that to then create learning opportunities that extend that learning. And then you have that last cluster, which is in domain 4, which is the professionalism cluster, and that's working with your fellow teachers, working with your leaders to extend your practice, working or being a part of professional organizations, such as this or AERA or whatever, IACTE, to really help grow your practice, and then showing professionalism, and that's advocating for students in your district policies, advocating for students maybe out in national policies or state policies. But for in your handout, in the PowerPoint handout, what I've done is I've taken all of these clusters, and so for every component within that cluster, I've taken a look at the indicators, summarized the indicators for what, so let's say we take this one, setting instructional outcomes, which is in the design cluster. So we have rigorous and challenging outcomes central to the discipline, focus on student learning and not student activity, making sure that the outcomes can be assessed, and then making sure that outcomes are differentiated. So what would happen then is that the internal observer, whoever the principal or leader would sit in the class, or this is actually not in the classroom, this is taking a look at lesson plans and engaging in that planning conversation with the teacher, and then this would be the things that they'd be looking for and listening for in that conversation, and looking for and listening for in the lesson plans. And then those are some examples. They actually come out of the early learning frameworks for what that might look like. And I've done that for each one of these components. I'm not going to go through because we would probably be here for another hour and a half if I went through and did that for each one of these, but maybe this will be something as you go through and do your group time, you could take a look at those and refer back to them. What I would like to do is just kind of engage in a conversation about what are the implications for this work on the Danielson for our early childhood teacher education. What do you think are some of the priorities? That was one of the questions when we did the training with the early childhood teachers. When you look at the Danielson framework and you hear, what this encompasses, what do you think from the early childhood field features of the Danielson? What are some of the most important components? Typically what we heard was of that management cluster, because they felt like if they didn't have the students engaged in the learning, if they weren't able to monitor and correct inappropriate behavior, if they didn't have their physical space organized in such a way that allowed for those smooth routines, then they felt like really they weren't able to be very effective teachers. So there we go. So these are the questions that actually I was interested in. Hopefully you're interested in them as well. So the first one is, if you were to help Charlotte determine up to 5 early learning teaching priorities at that pre-K through 3rd grade level, that would need to be addressed in the framework for teaching, what would they be? Which of the framework clusters that we just talked about somewhat, which of them would be priority practices for early childhood pre-K-3 teachers, and what value could the Danielson framework add to early childhood teacher education programs? Are there any practices or concerns out in the field right now that we feel like the Danielson could help us address? One of those, I know that we have seen just shortly, was kind of that assessment area. And what do we now know in our programs that align with the framework? So what are we currently doing in our early childhood programs? I've taken a look at our different standards, like the NACE standards, the DEC standards, the Gateways to Opportunity, and they align pretty well. Some have some concentrations where others don't. So there is quite a bit of alignment already in the standards that you're aligning to as preparation programs. But what does this then mean for coursework, our field-based experiences, the assessments, what we know about how we assess candidate learning, and then what resources would be helpful for the faculty and the candidates? Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to clarify my thinking. First of all, the premise that this is based on that if the teaching quality is high, then the children's test scores will go up. Is that one of the basic premises? That there's a strong correlation. So if I'm doing a really good job teaching, then my children should have higher test scores. So did you find that was that valid? Was that a valid assumption? Is that true according to your research? Yeah,
well, we haven't, because since we're still waiting on that, since we're still waiting on this spring data, student data, we can't make that claim as of yet. So.
But that was one of the foundational premises of this whole system. Is that, am I understanding?
Well, it's the foundational of the study. So as you know, with Charlotte Danielson, whenever this was initially, this was not meant to be any kind of an evaluation type instrument. It was basically to improve professional practice. So.
We haven't shown that link right across the board yet.
We haven't. Other studies have, but it's been at that higher grade level, 4 through high school.
And my second concern was if that is really a foundational premise, then the assessments need to be. So how I assess the learning needs to be an accurate assessment. And I don't know if it's most of the students who are moving along, or are we looking at a certain test score, or we're just looking at progress? Because there's a difference between everybody in my class making progress and everybody in my class passing certain scores. And I could be a good teacher and not have everybody be passing. So, I mean, I'm just concerned, and that's at every level. That could be preschool, elementary school, college. Just because everybody in my class may not be doing well does not necessarily mean that I'm not doing my job. So I'm wondering how this is working out.
Yeah, so for our study, we'd be looking at that progress. So there's not going to be any kind of a cut score of, well, they were supposed to achieve an 85, and well, these kids went from 60 to 70, but they didn't have that 85, so we're going to, say this teacher was bad. We're going to be looking at that progression.
And do you get, because there's 4 different domains, do you get areas where maybe this teacher is maybe not as proficient or not maybe judged as being quite up to par in a certain area, but let's say these students are still philosophing under this teachers.
And that'll probably be something that will come out of the qualitative data, because we didn't want to interrupt, we didn't want to have too many people in that classroom when we were doing the observations, because that tends to, so we already had 2, the principal and the external observer, come in. So we didn't want to bring in additional researchers, because that tends to make kids do things that are different than typical. So I think that'll be something that'll come more out of the, probably the qualitative interviews, but we haven't been that intensely in the classrooms. So that might be, yeah.
So what can you tell us that you were saying?
Well, like I said, since we're still in the process of collecting data, I can't give you any definitive findings now. What I can tell you is that we're seeing within the data, first, there is quite a bit of interracial reliability on the majority of the components. So that external observer and that external observer have pretty strong correlations. They feel like they're seeing the same things whenever they've reported the same critical attributes. Their notes look pretty similar, and their ratings are primarily within the proficient and excellent rating. So at that level, there seems to be a lot of agreement. So regardless if they are at, the pre-K level or, well, I guess I should say, so we've got probably about 4 or 5 principals that are those former middle school, high school teachers. Even within using the framework, they're still getting good iterative reliabilities with our external observers who have that pre-K experience and that K-3 experience. So I can tell you that right now we're seeing pretty good iterative reliabilities. What I can tell you, taking a look qualitatively at the data, though, is that we need to do a lot of training on our observers about what they're seeing in the classroom and collecting really good data that they can then feed back to their teachers to help them grow their practice. A lot of the observation data is probably not as specific as it needs to be. So, go ahead.
Can you explain again where the clusters came from?
The clusters came out of, there's a study, it's called the Helmsley Project, and they have been studying the Danielson framework in, it's Connecticut, here in Illinois, and another, I can't remember if it's New Jersey maybe, in school districts. They're actually presenting on this data in another week. But basically, those clusters are coming out of that research. So they're kind of doing very similar things that we are, having internal, external observers go in, observe teachers' practice. They've got logs, so the teachers and the leaders kind of are carrying around a little recording device. So it's probably they probably got a lot more reflective data on teachers and principals or those leaders really talking about what they're seeing. So,
Is that study cited anywhere in here?
no, it's just the results are just coming out. Like I said, they're presenting at AERA in another week and a half. So that'll probably be one of their first publications of the research. It just the Danielson consultant that has been doing the training for us on the Danielson has been kind of a consultant on that research and helping them kind of interpret the Danielson, and so that's just how she's been able to get a hold of those clusters ahead of time. Go ahead.
I don't know, you touched on it a couple times, the principles' interpretations. Chicago's doing the REACH, which is their version of the Danielson, preschool through 12. And I'm working with principals trying to interpret the early childhood.
Right.
They're using the same instrument across the board.
Yeah.
You found that the reliability was coming out?
So far, there's probably about 4 or 5 components, I should use the appropriate, 4 or 5 elements where there is some disagreement. But for the majority, out of all those 22 components, the majority of them are coming out to be pretty reliable.
I have a couple questions, kind of based on questions that were just asked. In terms of thinking about this with growth versus proficiency,
Right.
because I think about how this might be different, how observations might be differently interpreted with younger children as opposed to the 4th and up. And so going back to the fall conferences with the evaluators and the teachers, do you have any, I'm wondering, I'm just curious about 2 things. One, when teachers are talking with their evaluators about either a proficient level, like everyone's going to reach this benchmark, or a growth model, do you see that being different in the pre-K through 3rd classrooms? And then the second part of that is thinking about how it might be different in early learning is there a difference, do you see a difference at all in terms of sort of more cognitively oriented goals versus social emotionally oriented goals or approaches to learning or
I would say we probably didn't, in terms of that second question, we probably didn't get to that level, that depth of the research in terms of looking at cognitive versus social emotional. I would say, in terms, I would think, thinking back to the data, I would say that the majority of the observations that took place were probably either within the realm of math, science, or literacy. So, and in terms of your first question, and thinking about the proficient versus the growth. I'm not sure that that was as salient because one, we told them that we would not be looking at that rating. So the focus was on that critical attribute level. So we kind of took that focus off that proficient, excellent thing. So I don't think that I would say that there was a difference in those coaching conversations based on, are we looking at this from more of an accountability perspective versus a professional growth perspective. Now, I do know when we were, talking and giving training to the teachers and using these protocols with them, where they really had to fill out, what are you planning on doing in this observation? What does the observer need to know about what they're going to see? What do they need to know about your students? What do they need to know about the prior learning activities that took place, before they came in and how this now extends that prior learning? Teachers really had a really, really, really difficult time filling this out. They wanted to give the right answers. And so they really got, to them, this felt like almost like a test. And we noticed when we look at the pre-observation, kind of that planning data, it wasn't probably very well fleshed out because I think they had a hard time. I think a lot of the planning is here, and then when you ask them to type it out and write it out and make it explicit, I think that's a very difficult transition for them. So we noticed that a lot of times either the teachers didn't turn in a planning conference form or they did it all verbal, or they did it all verbal. But the teachers really had a difficult time. I would also say that the early childhood teachers, one of the things that we came out with the pre-K teachers particularly, with the ECHRs and kind of these other, program quality standards that we come in, they had a lot of, when they took a look at the Danielson framework and then they compared that to some of the other standards that they were being held to, they almost felt like they were being set up to, we heard a lot of time, we feel like we're being set up to fail. So if we have the principal coming in using this kind of state, teaching evaluation model, and then all of a sudden we have another person come in and they're using, the ECHRs or using the class or something else, then we feel like we're getting mixed messages on what I'm supposed to be doing that's quality. So I might rate high here, and I might rate low here. We also have heard, and this is not part of the research, but we've just have heard, from people contacting us saying that principals don't know. They want to try to be efficient, so they know that we've got this ECHRs thing coming in, and there's this scale, and they're using information and data from the ECHRs inappropriately. So we had teachers receiving poor ratings because, the door frames weren't wide enough. And so now it's, what do we need to be telling these leaders about how they integrate all of these different accountability systems to make sure that these poor teachers don't end up, and how do we give the teachers the ability to advocate for that and say, well, I know you want to use that data, but that's not appropriate. What we should be looking at is what I'm actually doing in the classroom. I can't change the door frame. So, or the resources. If I'm in a poor district and I would love to have all these resources, but we don't have the money to buy those resources, then don't ding me because I don't have that ability.
Yeah, one of the things I wonder about is, over the course of time, whether this would be a lever, whether through the validation study and using so many schools using Danielson pre-K third, whether it could be a lever towards valuing additional practices in the classroom in terms of, I'm looking at your number 2 question, in terms of thinking about more of an observational focus. We're so attuned to collecting data and how much more of it might be observationally based, be attentive to the social emotional skills building and not just some of the more cognitive domains that are concrete. And I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I think what'll be interesting, now that we have all this observation data that's comprehensive, touching on all 4 domains, now we're going to be having observation data coming in that's much more targeted. So I think it'll be interesting to take the data that was collected in this informal targeted observation versus this big global observation set. And I think it's going to be interesting, and I know Pam Rosa, who is working with us, has said, as she's done her work, that these informal observations, these 15, 20-minute targeted, very planned, intentional observations are actually much more effective than those big, one classroom global assessments, because you can really get down to the meat of what needs to be improved. Go ahead, Karen.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of things from a preschool for all perspective only, for teachers who are hoping to work in that venue. As much as we try to tell programs that the ECHRS is not a teacher evaluation, it is often, and any teacher, of course, looks at it and feels that it is. And so we work hard against the odds to convey that message and bring the administrator into the conversation when they're developing an improvement plan that indicates that a lot of this is administrative responsibility and not teacher. But that said, that may not be how teachers interpret it. But what we find when we look at our ECHRS scores over the years is that teachers are stuck in domain 2. And that is probably one of the only ways that I could defend the ECHRS as the right tool to be using for now, because we're identifying that teachers aren't able to get to good quality instruction because they can't even get some of the basic structural things, like setting up a classroom correctly, having an appropriate schedule that balances, active and quiet and interactive and teacher-directed and all of that. And so I think it's unfortunate. If I were a teacher, I'd be feeling everything you're describing that they're feeling, and certainly have felt that. But I see a lot of compatibility between this and the ECHRS in terms of, especially in domain 2, that if we could really help teachers strengthen domain 2, then they have the right framework from which then to start more quality instruction. But we're just seeing a lot of stuff right here.
Go ahead.
One of my concerns when you talk about like implications is when you look at this, the 4 components, especially when it's really designed for, it's not designed for pre-K or like through grade 3. Some of the terminology I think is very influential then as people are using it. So I think that's something that I would recommend maybe addressing, like instead of talking about lesson plans, you talk about learning plans or project planning or, I don't know, learning experiences. In that domain 2, when you talk about managing student behavior, instead our role really is to guide children's, interactions and it seems so negative response to misbehavior, instead something about guiding cooperative interactions, those kinds of things that we talk to our students about, and even with the instruction domain, the importance of scaffolding learning, are teachers responding to children's questions, are they guiding them toward in-depth learning? It's so different. The terminology has a strong impact on how teachers think that, understand what their role is in the classroom.
And it influences the observer.
Yeah. And so that's one of the things that we are, we'll continue this work. So, if you're interested in engaging in those conversations, because we try to not just do a research study and hand off the findings and say, thank you very much and see you later. We'd be happy, to start engaging, bringing together people and start really going through that language. Luckily enough, the Danielson group, which is kind of Charlotte Daniels, kind of the group that goes out and does the training and promotes the Danielson. They know about this study. I just had a conversation with one of the kind of Charlotte's right-hand, I don't want to say man, right-hand woman, and so she's very interested in this study. So if we can get that if we can get those concerns and then solutions for, instead of using this language, we should try to use this language, then we can get that message to that group, and then they can start thinking about further iterations. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that my reflection on this is that I think that there's needs to be more emphasis on the administrators and the directors and how they kind of couch all this or how they kind of approach it.
Right.
I think everyone's going to come up short somewhere for the rest of our lives eternally, and then the way you have a conversation about an improvement plan, you can scare the pants off of somebody, you can make them feel. I've had directors where I felt terror if they were coming by my room and it wasn't helpful at all, versus kind of this idea that we're going to coach you up in these areas. And I think it has to do with the way that the administrator approaches the assessment and the evaluation.
Right.
And so, it's a growth process, and we all can grow, and that's what's beautiful about teaching.
Right.
Every year you can get better at something, and not sort of being like, you're not good, but sort of being like, this is where we're gonna work and grow. And so, I think it's a lot of pressure on teachers and not enough pressure on administrators to kind of try to develop their staff and not just, carrot stick, that sort of stuff. So I could just go on and on about it, but I just think people are beating teachers up like crazy.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, we do have a relationship with the Illinois Principals Association, and I know IRC has been working with them on developing early childhood professional development for our principals. And so, and then in Illinois, we just passed legislation that requires all principal preparation programs to include early childhood content in them as well. And our group has developed what we call the linked curriculum module, which is then kind of like a series of lessons about what does early childhood look like when we talk about this P3 system and what's their role as the principal, and then we'll start adding in this teacher evaluation stuff too, so that they know what the Danielson framework, what we think early childhood classrooms look like when they walk into a classroom. It may look totally different if they're a middle school teacher than what they would totally expect, but they should be able to tell the difference between good and bad.
Have you had a chance to look at the feedback from the teachers who were actually in the study?
That's what we're going to be doing here the next couple weeks. Not yet. So we'll be starting those site visits here in another week or two.
Did all of your evaluators, both internal and external, have the same training?
They did.
They all go through the ISP modules?
They did.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and I was and in terms of the state model, that training, I think a lot of people are under this. That is not Danielson training. That's training on. So there's a lot of people I know that I've talked to who have thought that was Danielson training, and it is not. So so they did all go through. They went through, and the teachers went through the training as well. So the principals, the teachers, and the external observers all heard the same messages about what the Danielson looks like, what they should be doing in the observations, so they all heard the same messages.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of moving us to this next piece, but I'm wondering, in terms of higher education, I teach an assessment class, and I have my students go out and I have them research the Danielson framework and think about it in different ways. But there's not a ton to support us in terms of higher ed faculty for sharing this information with our students. And so I'm wondering if there are plans for that level, or maybe there's something out there that I've missed.
No, there probably isn't anything because like I said, a lot of the work around the Danielson has been focusing on what training, what resources do we provide to the teachers and the principals, observers. So that's kind of why I added this 5, what resources would be helpful for faculty. And maybe that's another next step that this project could go. How do we help?
I could see even modules or something like that we could share with, because I always fear giving misinformation. And so I have them go out and do research and see what they can find online and present back to their classmates, and then I kind of fill in the blanks from what I know. But I always feel like they should really know a lot about this because they have no clue about any of this. And so I know, and then in other pieces is how you're kind of tying this in with things that we're already doing. And I know at ISU, in early childhood, and in the teacher preparation programs in general, where we really work to try to make connections for our students between the Danielson framework and the ATPA process, because they are parallel in a lot of ways. And so we really wish the state would have kind of maybe thought about that a little more, but that's okay. We're trying to make it work for our students, and so I think the more we can help them see that this is, because they're frustrated about EdTPA, they're frustrated about Danielson, and so trying to figure out how we can at least try to help them make those.
And I think, to the state's defense, they don't have the time and the resources. This is a $500,000 study. So to be able to have those resources, to be able to do that. So that's kind of where our center tries to come in and kind of serve as that way of, facilitating and bringing people from the field together and then allowing those resources to grow up out of the field rather than coming from the state top down.
So this isn't pre-service, it's post, in service, but we, as Lisa mentioned briefly, Lisa and the center, Brian and Cindy, who's worked super over here, who's working with him now. We have already had one and are continuing some meetings to talk about PD for teachers about the Danielson, just like a, everything you wanted to know, kind of. And a parallel one for administrators.
Go ahead.
But I think as that happens, it's important to be cautionary and just what you're saying here, that it really has not at this point been developed for pre-K through third grade. And so whenever you take a model and put it, on another age range that it hasn't been prepared, we always have to be very cautious. So I appreciate your attention to that, but we need that message out before people, it's like the steamroller that's already going. It's very concerning.
Well, I guess what I didn't yet, I'm sorry, is that the PD will be centered on early childhood. And the examples, the early learning examples that Lisa has worked with some of the preschool for all coaches, one sitting right here, helping work on examples that an observer could use as guidance in an early childhood setting. And so what I didn't say was that the PD, teachers and administrators, will be focusing on that.
Yeah. And I'm hoping with that group too that we can start having the conversations about, well, what additional resources. So it's not just the examples, but how do we, whether it is scenarios, your domain 2, you go and observe, here's what you might see. But I think you first have to kind of work through the Danielson a little bit, through those learning examples to really get that in-depth knowledge. Gotcha.
But she's right. Right now, it feels to the early childhood teachers out in the field like there is a steamroller coming because they may not have a principal that has that early childhood knowledge, and they're saying, well, you can't do this because you're an early child. Your higher level questioning won't be appropriate. They're looking at what you would ask a high school student. So they're getting a lot of some serious issues because some districts are now taking the Danielson, and that may apply to their retention, may apply to a salary increase. So they're really feeling the pressure. Very, very stressful for these teachers, and they will be thrilled to have the information like Karen was talking about, because they don't even really know what is expected.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that we have found, and that's the reason why we were intentional in making sure that the teachers did receive that same training, because I think a lot of times teachers feel like, well, everybody else knows what I'm being evaluated on, but I don't know what I'm being evaluated on. And we really wanted to give them that ability to feel empowered. Well, you know your classroom best, you know your kids best, you know your strengths best, you know your weaknesses best. So, have the ability to learn how to advocate for themselves and for their kids in their classroom.
I'd like to ask about the professional development. You're going to do it for teachers and you're going to do it for administrators. Will faculty like us be able to sit in on those? Because that's what I think somebody was referring to. We need to know because we need to be preparing our students.
And we're thinking about the buildings as well. And also maybe connecting it with the HERO website and making sure that you understand where all the resources are. So we're just beginning the collaboration efforts, but we are considering all those. So thank you for that.
So I've heard a lot about the student management piece, but what about like the domain 3, the instruction or the professional responsibilities? I'm surprised I haven't heard anything about the family piece, because that typically is pretty strong in family in the early childhood field. A lot of times the administrators don't value that as much as well, and so you'll typically find that in the professional responsibilities, but it's not as clear in some of the others. Go ahead.
And I think as well as the domain and planning, we need to address special needs, but nothing about English language learners.
That's right. Yeah. And I know there's a special education group here in the state who's worked on looking at the Danielson framework for the special education, teachers of special education. I'm not sure there's been as much of an effort around the dual language learners. So, yeah, do you know anything, Joyce? Yeah. So, and I know, like I said, we've got a really good population in our students, but knowing what we know about our teaching workforce, we don't have a very diverse teaching sample. So that was another kind of when we were talking with our University of Illinois partners, that's one of the things that they said would be a nice next step is to have more a diversity in our teaching ranks within this, just to see if there's some of those biases. I know we've been talking a lot about how sometimes evaluations, we've talked about it more at the principal prep, how we may not bring in a diverse either African American or Hispanic. We may not, for whatever our biases are, may not select them for our principal preparation because we have different styles of communicating and kind of those cultural differences. So it'd be interesting to see if we had a more diverse teacher, if we had more African American and Hispanic teachers, if we would see any of those biases play out in these observations as well. So that might be another next step that we try to pursue. So we had talked about some of the others. We just have like a few extra minutes. In terms of like the NACE standards, the DEC standards, is there anything, typically, I think we're surprised in terms of our research participants. We have not heard from them yet that they don't feel like the Danielson is inappropriate for that pre-K through third grade level. So far we've heard really positive things about the Danielson, that they feel like it's a good framework just for thinking about what is good teaching. So is there anything within kind of thinking at the teacher preparation level and knowing about what we know about NACE standards, DEC standards, our gateways competencies, is there anything that you see within the framework and what you've heard within the framework that seems like there would be a tension there? I know we talked about there's a lot of language, and I think by pulling out some of that language from NACE, that might help us think about retailoring some of that about the scaffolding and having more positive messages about discipline, and so that might be those might be sources too. Yeah.
And as you talk about family and how connected early learning tends to be community and family as opposed to some of the higher grades. You know, we think about 51% of our kids are living in low-income poverty settings and all the stress that comes with that. I think about this over time, given that we're the only state in the country that has a P12 principal endorsement, which you should take a lot of credit for. I wonder collectively how these can fit together to sort of push up in terms of thinking about, you know, why aren't we more formally looking at classroom management and family connections as goals for the classroom teacher every year, and that we're still defaulting, and might that change over time, that we're still defaulting to language literacy and math, as opposed to, and I know why, but I still wonder, can this be used as a lever over time with administrator training and our new principal prep to kind of push up about those skills that are important?
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why we pursued this study, was we thought, well, maybe, using this as a policy lever. We know all the principals are going to have to go out and they're going to have to go into their pre-K programs, they're going to have to go into their K-3 classrooms. So is this the policy lever to finally get them to go, aha, maybe I don't know what I think I know about what these programs should look like?
I'm thrilled you're getting this embedded in the principal training. What about the majority of principals that are now getting PK classrooms in the building? They've been a principal for years. That's the population I'm more worried about.
Well, that's that training that we're going to be pursuing through IPA and some of the other other administrator organizations. So, I think it just, help. I think it's just relying on the field too of going, and just telling these administrators, you need to go back and learn more. So I think, I know oftentimes there can be, contentious relationships between the teachers and their leaders, but I still think they need to hear it from multiple sources that they may need an additional training. So, okay. Well, I think it's 10:30, so to stay within our time limits, is there any last minute questions? If not, then I'll let you go on to your next. Yep.